The shrine behind the garden, a battle against darkness. A forgotten village shrouded in thick, foreboding silence hides the grim truth behind an old shrine at its edge. Edward, a weary villager plagued by poverty, struggles to keep up with oppressive taxes. His encounters with harsh local officials only deepen his despair. That night, after a chance meeting with his suffering neighbor Thomas, Edward learns of a chilling secret tied to the village's past, a malevolent spirit inhabiting the old shrine. The spirit has been preying on the village's poorest, drawing them into a spiral of terror and tragedy. As a storm brews, Edward is thrust into a nightmarish ordeal when Thomas reveals that the spirit's curse has now turned its gaze on him. Determined to protect his family, Edward must confront the unholy force lurking within the dark shrine. The tension escalates as each flickering shadow and whispering wind bring Edward closer to uncovering the truth behind the shrine's unspeakable evil. This harrowing encounter threatens to consume him, heart, body, and soul. Part 1. The Haunted Village. The forest was ancient, its trees towering above the forgotten village, their branches twisted and gnarled as if they bore witness to centuries of darkness. Beneath this canopy, the village cowered in perpetual fear. Shadows clung to every corner, whispers of a curse carried on the wind. The sun's descent brought no reprieve, only the creeping dread of nightfall and what might awaken when darkness fell. Edward was a man hardened by years of toil, but the weariness in his eyes spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. His life was a daily struggle against hunger and death, but lately, an even darker spectre loomed over him and the other villagers, the shrine. It stood at the forest's edge, ancient stones cracked and covered in moss. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew its legend. The shrine housed something old and malevolent, a presence that preyed upon the suffering of the living. To Edward, it was more than just a story, it was the source of the village's misery. Twilight painted the sky in crimson hues as Edward trudged home, the weight of another fruitless day pressing on his shoulders. His calloused hands clenched at the tin sack of grain, barely enough to last a week, let alone pay the taxes that would soon be due. He glanced warily at the path leading to the shrine, a chill creeping up his spine. The village square was eerily quiet, doors and windows shuttered tight as night approached. Fear was palpable, an oppressive blanket that wrapped itself around every soul. As Edward approached his home, Margaret, his wife, was already at the doorway, her face etched with worry. She had aged far beyond her year's grief, and fear had stolen whatever softness she once possessed. Their daughter, Anna, peeked out from behind her mother, her wide eyes reflecting both curiosity and the burden of too much knowledge for a child so young. Did they listen? Margaret had asked, though the answer was evident in the slump of his shoulders. No, Edward replied, his voice hollow. They don't care. He stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The wind howled through the cracks in their walls, and for a moment it almost sounded like a voice, a mournful wail carried from the direction of the shrine. Edward shivered. Dinner was a sparse affair. The fire crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Every sound, every creak of the wind outside made Edward's heart race, but he tried to focus on Margaret and Anna, their small smiles forced as they shared what little food they had. But he could not banish the memory of the magistrate's cruel eyes, the sneering grin as he demanded payment by the next full moon. Edward had seen what happened to those who couldn't pay. Old Thomas found hanging from a tree, a warning to anyone who dared resist. When the meal was finished, Edward sat by the fire, staring into the dying embers. His mind raced. How could he protect his family? What could he possibly do? The shrine's curse had made the magistrate more ruthless, feeding off the fear that gripped the village. He clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. I won't let them take you, he whispered to Margaret, but the words felt like a lie. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The shadows seemed to press closer, as if listening. A sudden knock at the door made Edward jump. He grabbed the rusted knife that lay near the hearth, a pitiful weapon, but it was all he had. He moved toward the door, muscles taut, ready to defend his family. Margaret's eyes were wide with fear. Who would come at this hour, she whispered, clutching Anna to her chest. Edward opened the door a crack, and rain lashed against his face. Standing there, drenched and trembling, was Thomas, his neighbor and friend. The man's eyes were wild with terror. Edward, he gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. It's happening again. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean?" Thomas staggered inside, collapsing onto a chair. "The shrine," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's awake." The room fell silent, save for the wind howling outside. Edward's mind raced. He wanted to believe Thomas was mistaken, that this was all just a nightmare. But deep down he knew it was true. The curse was real. The disappearances, the strange lights, the cold wind that seemed to come from nowhere, all of it pointed to the same grim truth. The shrine's power was growing. "We have to do something," Edward said, his voice shaking. "We can't just let it take more of us." Thomas's eyes met his, filled with despair. "What can we do? It's stronger than us. It feeds on our fear." Edward felt the weight of those words pressing down on him. But he couldn't give in, not now. He had too much to lose. "We'll fight it," he said, though his hands trembled. "Whatever it takes." Rain poured harder as Edward and Thomas stepped back into the night. The wind screamed through the trees, carrying with it a cold that seemed to sink into their bones. They moved toward the edge of the village, where the forest grew thick and wild. The path was narrow and treacherous, roots twisting underfoot. Edward's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the presence of the shrine even before he saw it. The air grew colder, heavier, as if pressing down on him. The stone structure loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar, dark symbols glowing faintly. The shadows moved. Edward saw them shift and writhe as if alive. He swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he couldn't, not now. He stepped closer, each footfall feeling like a march toward his own grave. The shadows surged, cold tendrils reaching for him. He could hear whispers, soft, insidious voices that spoke of his failures, his fears. They promised relief from his pain, an end to his suffering. All he had to do was give in. "No," Edward whispered, his voice raw. "You won't have me." The shadows tightened their grip, cold and suffocating. Images flashed before his eyes: Margaret's tears, Anna's laughter. He couldn't let the darkness win. Summoning every ounce of strength, he pushed back. A light flared within him, fueled by love and desperation. The shadows recoiled, shrieking, their hold slipping. For a moment, Edward thought he had won. But then he saw Thomas, his friend, twisted and lifeless, pulled into the darkness. The shadows closed around him, and his screams echoed into the night. Edward stumbled back, tears streaming down his face. He had failed. With trembling hands, he pushed the shrine's doors shut. The darkness within roared, but it was trapped, at least for now. Rain pelted his face as he fell to his knees. The shrine's hunger had not been sated. It would come again, and when it did, the village would have to face it once more. Edward made his way home, his heart heavy with grief and fear. He found Margaret waiting, her eyes searching his for answers. Together, they clung to each other, knowing that the battle was far from over. The curse of the shrine still lingered, its dark tendrils reaching for them all, and when it called again, Edward would have to be ready no matter the cost. Part 2. Despair at Dusk. The sky was a tapestry of dying light, streaked with deep oranges and reds, as if the sun bled out its final moments. Shadows stretched long across the village square, clawing their way over the cobblestones and creeping up the walls of the squat, weathered buildings. It was a place that had known better days, but those days were long forgotten, buried beneath the weight of poverty and fear. At this hour, the square should have been bustling with life, merchants hawking their goods, children playing beneath the gaze of weary parents. Instead, an oppressive silence hung over everything, broken only by the hushed murmur of villagers gathered at its center. Edward stood among them, his face pale and drawn. The weight of his debt pressed on him like a stone, and the eyes of the villagers, pitying, fearful, hopeless, burned holes into his back. He did not want to be here, on display before the entire village, but he had no choice. The local magistrate had summoned him, and defiance was not an option. He swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear coating his tongue. The magistrate's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the heavy air. "Edward," he spat the name as though it offended him. The man was tall and thin, with eyes like polished stone cold, unfeeling, and utterly ruthless. He wore the fine robes of his station, but even they seemed tarnished by the filth of his soul. Beside him stood two guards, their faces expressionless beneath steel helms, hands resting on the hilts of their blades. Edward stepped forward, each movement requiring more effort than the last. His limbs felt leaden, his breath shallow. He tried to steel himself, but the memory of old Thomas's body swinging from the oak tree made him shiver. This was no place for mercy. "You are late on your payment," the magistrate said, his tone flat, devoid of any human warmth. Again Edward's jaw clenched. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but now that he stood here, words failed him. He forced himself to speak, his voice raw and desperate. "I beg you, my lord. The harvest was poor. There's been sickness. I need more time." The magistrate's lip curled. "Time," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "What have you done with the time you were given? Squandered it, no doubt, just as you have squandered every other opportunity." Edward shook his head, panic rising. "I have worked day and night. Please, I have a family. My daughter," he stopped himself, knowing it was a mistake the moment the words left his mouth. The magistrate's eyes narrowed, glinting with a cruel light. "A daughter," you say. The words were soft, almost thoughtful. The crowd shifted uneasily. Everyone knew what was coming. "Perhaps it is time your family pays what you cannot know," Edward's voice cracked, and he fell to his knees. "Pride be damned, this was about survival. Take anything else. My land, my tools." The magistrate stepped closer, his shadow falling over Edward like a shroud. "You have nothing of value left, Edward. Nothing except your life and the lives of those you hold dear. This is the cost of your failure." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by a single glance from the magistrate. He savored the power he held over them. Their fear was his nourishment. "You have 1 week," he said, his voice dripping with finality. "1 week to pay your debt in full. If you fail, we will take what is owed, in whatever form we see fit." Edward's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He wanted to scream, to fight, to tear the smug expression from the magistrate's face. But he was powerless. He could feel the weight of every eye upon him, and the knowledge that no one would help him. No one dared. The guards stepped forward, their armored boots thudding against the cobbles. Edward rose shakily to his feet, his head bowed. He had been dismissed, and to remain any longer would invite further punishment. He stumbled away from the square, the crowd parting before him like a sea of ghosts. No one spoke to him, no one met his gaze. They were too afraid, and he couldn't blame them. He passed familiar faces, neighbors, friends who once shared laughter and bread. Now they turned away, their eyes empty. As Edward walked, the weight of his shame and fear grew heavier, pressing him down, threatening to crush him. The walk home felt longer than usual. The sky had darkened, the last traces of sunlight swallowed by night. Edward's feet dragged through the dirt, and each step seemed to echo the beating of his heart. He thought of Margaret, of Anna, waiting for him at home. How could he tell them what had happened? How could he admit that he had failed? When he reached the small, crumbling hut that was his home, he hesitated at the door. The light of a single candle flickered within, casting shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment he imagined turning away, disappearing into the forest. Maybe the shrine would take him, end his suffering. But then he heard Anna's laughter, a bright, pure sound in the darkness, and he knew he could never leave them. He pushed the door open. Margaret was there, her eyes red-rimmed from tears. She took one look at him and knew. "What did they say?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Edward couldn't speak. He fell into her arms, his body trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Margaret held him tight, her own tears falling silently. There was nothing more to say. They both knew what was at stake. Anna, unaware of the storm that threatened to consume them, ran to her father and wrapped her small arms around his leg. Edward knelt and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. He wanted to remember this moment, the warmth of her embrace, the innocence in her eyes. It was a fleeting comfort, and he clung to it desperately. Night deepened, and with it came the cold. Edward sat by the dying fire, his mind racing. How could he find the money? How could he protect his family from the magistrate's wrath? There was no answer, only the cruel certainty that time was running out. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something ancient, and hungrier reminder that the shrine still waited, its darkness creeping ever closer. As the fire sputtered and died, Edward made a silent vow he would not let them take his family. He would fight, even if it cost him everything. But deep down, fear coiled in his gut, whispering that it would not be enough. Darkness pressed against the walls of their home, and Edward knew that despair had only just begun to sink its claws into their lives. Part 3. A Desperate Visitor. Nightfall descended upon the village like a shroud, cloaking every path and hovel in a suffocating darkness. A chill wind howled through the skeletal branches of ancient trees, rattling shutters, sending whispers skittering across rooftops. Within Edward's modest home, the meager warmth of a sputtering fire fought back against the encroaching cold. Shadows danced along the cracked walls, flickering with every gust. Edward sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Margaret and Anna had gone to bed hours earlier, but sleep was a luxury Edward could no longer afford. As he stared into the dying embers, a heavy knock shattered the oppressive quiet. It was sudden, loud and frantic, more a plea than a summons. Edward's heart pounded in his chest. Who would come at this hour? Fear coiled in his stomach, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beyond their thin walls. He reached for the rusted knife that lay beside the fire, a pitiful weapon, but the only one he had. Edward, a voice called, muffled by the wind, "Please open up." He recognized the voice. It was Thomas, his neighbor, and one of the few men Edward could call a friend. But something in Thomas's tone was wrong, desperate, terrified. Edward hesitated only a moment before unbarring the door. It flew open, slamming against the wall as Thomas tumbled inside, his eyes wild, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Rain streamed down his face, mingling with sweat and tears. He looked as though he had seen death itself. "Close it," Thomas rasped, his voice cracking. "Close the door." Edward did as he was told, bolting it shut against the storm outside. "What is it?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the knife. "What's happened?" Thomas collapsed onto a stool, his body shaking. He pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, as if trying to banish some terrible vision. "It's awake," he whispered, his eyes darting to the window, as if expecting the darkness to reach in and claim him. "The shrine is awake." The word sent a jolt of ice through Edward's veins. He wanted to believe he had misheard, that Thomas was rambling, but the terror in his friend's eyes left no room for doubt. Edward's mouth went dry. "You're sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Thomas nodded, his face pale as death. "I saw it. I heard it." His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "The spirit is hunting again." Silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Outside, the wind howled louder, battering the walls. The villagers had spoken of the shrine for generations, always in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly would summon its wrath. It was a place of darkness and despair, home to a vengeful spirit bound by ancient, forgotten rites. But now those rites were breaking, and the spirit's hunger had returned. Edward sank into a chair, his mind reeling. Why now, he asked, though he wasn't sure if he wanted an answer. Thomas's hands clawed at his own arms, leaving red marks. "The fear, Edward, the suffering. It feeds on it." His eyes met Edward's, and for a moment they were just two men, both terrified and powerless. "It waits until we're at our weakest, until hope is gone. Then it strikes." A chill settled over the room, deeper than the cold outside. Edward thought of Margaret and Anna asleep in the next room, unaware of the terror creeping closer. He stood abruptly, pacing the small space. "We have to stop it," he said, the words hollow even as they left his lips. How could they fight something so ancient, so malevolent? He glanced at Thomas, hoping for some spark of courage, but found only despair. "There is no stopping it," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "It's taken before. It will take again." No, Edward refused to accept it. He wouldn't allow it. "We have to do something." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes wide and frantic. "There's only one way." He hesitated, as if speaking the words would seal their fate. "The spirit preys on fear, on weakness. We have to face it." "Confront it." Edward's breath caught. "Confront it." He shook his head. "That's madness." "Madness is doing nothing." Thomas shot back, his voice trembling but firm. "If we don't act, it will take more of us. Our families. Our children." His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. "It took my brother Edward, years ago. He was just a boy." Edward's heart ached for him. He remembered the stories how Thomas's brother had vanished one stormy night, leaving only a trail of footprints that led to the shrine. No one had dared to follow. The elders had called it a tragedy, a warning. But Edward now saw it for what it was, a sacrifice. "We can't do this alone," Edward said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need the others." "They won't come," Thomas said bitterly. "They're too afraid. They pretend it's not real. They think if they close their eyes it will go away." Edward's fists clenched. He understood their fear, but he couldn't let it paralyze him, not anymore. He thought of Anna's laughter, of Margaret's weary smile. He would not let the darkness take them. "Then we go alone," he said, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Thomas looked at him, a flicker of hope battling with despair. "You're sure no," Edward admitted, "but we have no choice." A sudden gust of wind blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. For a heartbeat neither man moved. Then, in the faint light of the dying embers, they saw it a shadow, darker than night, slithering along the edge of the window. The spirit was watching. It knew. Panic surged through Edward, but he forced it down. "We leave now," he said, his voice low but resolute. Before it grew stronger, they gathered what little they had: Edward's knife, a lantern, a few scraps of food. Every moment felt like an eternity, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them. As they stepped outside, the wind bit at their skin, and the darkness seemed alive, shifting and breathing. The path to the shrine was narrow, overgrown with twisted roots and brambles. But each step was a struggle, the air growing colder with every breath. The closer they came, the heavier the air became, until it felt like they were wading through a sea of dread. The shrine loomed ahead, its stone doors cracked open. Faint whispers drifted out, calling, beckoning. Edward's grip tightened on the knife. He had never felt so small, so powerless. But he had made a vow to protect his family, no matter the cost. Thomas hesitated, fear etched into every line of his face. "This is where it begins," he said, his voice trembling. "And where it ends," Edward nodded, unable to speak. Together they stepped forward, their shadows swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, promising pain, death, and despair. The air was thick with malice, pressing down on them like a suffocating weight. Inside the shrine, the darkness moved. Edward could feel it cold, ancient, hungry. It reached for them, testing their resolve. But he raised the lantern, the flame flickering, casting fleeting light. For a moment he saw it, eyes that burned like embers, a face twisted in fury. The spirit lunged, its form shifting, tendrils of shadow stretching toward them. "Stand your ground," Edward shouted, though terror gripped his heart. He slashed with the knife, the blade passing through the darkness as if through mist. The spirit laughed, a sound that echoed with centuries of suffering. Thomas screamed as the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him toward the darkness. Edward lunged, but it was too late. His friend's eyes met his one last time, filled with terror and despair. Then Thomas was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Edward fell to his knees, the knife slipping from his grasp. The spirit's laughter filled the shrine, reverberating through his bones. He wanted to give up, to surrender to the overwhelming despair. But he couldn't, not yet. He grabbed the lantern and hurled it at the spirit. Flames erupted, and for a moment the shadows recoiled, hissing and shrieking. Gasping for breath, Edward stumbled back. The flames died quickly, but they had bought him a moment. He pushed himself to his feet, tears streaming down his face. "This isn't over," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I will come back." The spirit's laughter followed him as he fled the shrine, its cold promise echoing in his mind. It had taken Thomas. It would take more, but Edward would fight because he had no choice. The darkness had awakened, and the battle had only just begun. Part 4. The curse revealed. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the wooden beams of Edward's home and seeping through every crack, carrying with it a cold that settled deep in the bones. The fire in the heart sputtered and hissed, casting faint, flickering light across the room. Edward and Thomas sat opposite each other at a rickety table, their faces shadowed and weary. Outside, the storm raged, as if the world itself sought to drown out the words that Thomas was about to speak. Thomas's hands trembled as he lifted the cup of water Edward had given him, but he barely sipped. Instead, he stared into the liquid, his gaze distant and haunted. Edward watched him, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. He didn't dare speak, afraid of what he might hear, yet knowing that he had to listen. Finally, Thomas took a shaky breath and began. "It was a child," he said, his voice low and ragged, "the first to vanish." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Edward leaned in, his heart pounding. He had heard whispers of the shrine's curse all his life, but they were fragments, tales told in hushed tones and fearful glances. This was different. This was real. Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving the cup. "It happened long before our time. The village was different then, thriving, filled with laughter and life. No one feared the forest. They would walk beneath the trees, gather herbs, hunt game. But one day a child wandered too far. He was just a boy no older than Anna. His voice cracked at the mention of Edward's daughter, and he swallowed hard before continuing. He heard something voices, they said, sweet, gentle whispers that promised him everything a child's heart could desire. Sweets, toys, love. Edward felt a chill crawl up his spine. He followed the voices, he said, his own voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, his grip tightening around the cup until his knuckles turned white. He followed them deep into the forest to the shrine. When his parents realized he was missing, the whole village searched. They found his footprints leading to the shrine's door, but beyond that he trailed off, his eyes closing as if to block out the memory. There was nothing, no sign of him, just silence. Edward shivered, picturing the scene. The thought of a child, innocent and trusting, lured by something so insidious, made his blood run cold. And then he prompted, though dread coiled in his gut. Thomas opened his eyes, and they were wet with unshed tears. And then it began. One by one, people started to disappear. It was slow at first, a hunter who strayed too far, a woman gathering herbs at dusk. But it grew worse. The whisper spread. People spoke of lights in the woods, of shadows that moved even when the wind was still. The elders said the shrine had become a doorway, a place where the spirit fed on our fear, our pain. It lured the weak, and the desperate Edward's breath quickened. Why hasn't anyone destroyed it, sealed it for good? Thomas laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of joy. Many have tried. Priests, warriors, even those who claimed to be sorcerers. They came with fire and holy words, with weapons and charms. Some never returned. Those who did, they spoke of horrors that defied reason. One man clawed out his own eyes, screaming that he couldn't unsee what lay beyond the shrine's door. Silence fell again, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Edward's mind raced. This was more than he had ever imagined. The shrine wasn't just cursed, it was a predator, feeding on their misery. Why tell me this now? He asked, his voice raw. Why tonight? Thomas's eyes met his, and Edward saw the depths of his torment. Because it took my son, Thomas whispered, and the tears he had been holding back finally fell. Last year. Do you remember when he went missing? Edward nodded, his throat tight. He remembered all too well. Thomas's boy, a bright-eyed child who had often played with Anna, had vanished without a trace. The village had searched for days, but deep down they all knew. They had whispered the truth behind closed doors, that the shrine had claimed another soul. But Thomas had never spoken of it, not until now. It took him, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I heard the whispers that night. I heard them calling to him. I tried to stop it. I ran into the woods shouting his name, but by the time I reached the shrine, it was too late. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. I heard him, Edward. I heard him calling for me, begging for me to help, but I couldn't save him. Edward's chest ached with grief and helplessness. He wanted to comfort his friend, to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that he had done all he could. But the words felt hollow. What comfort could there be when faced with such horror? He reached out, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. We'll find a way to end this, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Thomas looked up, his eyes hollow. Do you think I haven't tried? I've prayed, I've begged, I've offered everything I have. But it doesn't care. It only wants one thing, our fear, our suffering. That's what gives it strength. Edward felt the weight of those words settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The spirit fed on their pain, and it would keep feeding until there was nothing left. There has to be a way, he said, more to himself than to Thomas. There has to be. Thomas shook his head. You don't understand. It's not just a spirit, it's ancient. Older than this village, older than the trees. It was bound to the shrine for a reason. But those bindings are failing. The more it feeds, the stronger it becomes. Soon it will be free. The fire crackled, and for a moment it seemed to dim, as if the darkness itself was listening. Edward's mind raced. He thought of Margaret and Anna, of the life they had struggled to build. He couldn't let the spirit win. We have to find a way, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at him. We can't give up. Thomas's gaze was bleak. I've already lost everything, he said softly. My wife, my son. There's nothing left for me. But you still have something to fight for. He stood abruptly, his movements jerky and unsteady. That's why I came, to warn you. To tell you what you're facing, Edward rose, his legs trembling. You can't do this alone, Thomas smiled, a sad, broken thing. I already have. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Be careful, Edward. The whispers, they never really stop. Even now, I can hear them. With that, he stepped out into the storm, the wind swallowing him whole. Edward stood frozen, his mind reading. The fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for him. The whispers were real. The spirit was real, and it would come for them all if they didn't find a way to stop it. As the door creaked shut, Edward felt the cold press in around him. The battle had begun, and the darkness was already closing in. He clenched his fists, fear and determination warring within him. He would protect his family no matter the cost. But as the wind howled and the shadows danced, he knew that the path ahead would be one of terror, pain and sacrifice. The shrine was awake, and it was hungry. Part 5. The Spirit Awakens. The rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 drumbeats, relentless and cold. Water streamed down the walls of Edward's small, weather-beaten home, pooling around the edges of the floorboards. Outside, the wind howled, its mournful cries weaving through the trees like the lament of forgotten souls. Inside, the fire sputtered and dimmed, casting weak, fitful light that did little to chase away the encroaching darkness. Edward sat hunched by the hearth, staring into the embers, as if willing them to burn brighter, but the chill that seeped into his bones was not one that could be banished by warmth alone. A sudden gust of wind tore through the room, extinguishing the flame in an instant. The darkness rushed in, thick and suffocating, and for a moment there was only the sound of the rain and Edward's ragged breathing. He reached for the lantern, his hands trembling. As he fumbled to strike a match, something moved in the corner of his vision, a shadow that slithered across the wall, too fast and too fluid to be anything natural. The match flared, casting a brief, flickering light. It illuminated Margaret's pale face as she stood in the doorway to the next room, her eyes wide with fear. Edward, she whispered, her voice taut with panic. What was that? I don't know, he lied, though his heart thundered in his chest. He knew. Deep down he had always known. The shadows writhed again, dancing along the walls as if mocking him. They whispered, low and insidious, their voices like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Edward strained to make out the words, but all he could hear was a promise of despair, of pain yet to come. His blood ran cold. The door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that made the whole house shudder. Rain and wind surged in, soaking everything in their path. Standing in the doorway, drenched and wild-eyed, was Thomas. His face was pale, his lips blue, and he shook with more than just the cold. Edward, he gasped, clutching the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. It's happening. Edward rose, the lantern flickering in his hand. What do you mean, the shrine? Thomas choked out, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to press closer with every word. It's awake and is coming for us. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. The wind howled louder, and the shadows deepened, taking on shapes that seemed almost human, distorted, monstrous versions of men and women, their faces twisted with malice. Edward could feel the air growing colder, as if every breath was being drawn from his lungs. Margaret, he said, his voice rough. Take Anna, go to the cellar. Don't come out until I return. No, Edward, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Don't leave us, I have to, he said, his heart breaking with every word. I have to end this, he turned to Thomas, who was still panting, his eyes darting wildly. Are you with me? Thomas nodded, though fear etched deep lines into his face. We have no choice. The two men stepped outside, the wind tearing at their clothes and the rain lashing their faces. The village was eerily silent, as if the storm had driven all life away. But Edward knew better. It wasn't the storm they feared, it was the thing that had awakened in the shrine. He could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his soul, heavy and suffocating. The path to the shrine loomed before them, narrow and winding, bordered by ancient trees whose branches clawed at the sky. Each step they took felt like a march toward their own deaths. The ground was slick with mud, and Edward stumbled more than once, catching himself on tree roots and rocks. Beside him, Thomas's breath came in short, sharp gasps, each one a testament to the terror that gripped him. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that to turn back would mean death, perhaps not just for them, but for everyone they loved. Ahead, the shrine came into view, its stone doors cracked open. A pale, sickly light seeped out, casting long, jagged shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. The air was colder here, biting and cruel. Edward's breath fought before him, and he gripped the lantern tighter, its light a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they approached, the light from the shrine post growing brighter and then dimming, as if it had a heartbeat. Edward could hear the whispers now, clearer than before. They spoke his name over and over, in 1,000 different voices, some familiar, some horrifyingly alien. He tried to block them out, but they wormed their way into his mind, dredging up memories he had long buried, fears he thought he had conquered. Edward, the voices hissed, their tone mocking. "Why fight? You are already ours." "Shut up," he growled, though the sound of his own voice did little to drown out the whispers. He stepped closer to the shrine, his legs trembling. "Thomas, help me close it." Thomas hesitated, his eyes wide with terror. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't go near it, you have to," Edward said, desperation creeping into his voice. "We have to stop it." Before Thomas could respond, the ground beneath them cracked open with a deafening roar. Black tendrils shot out, writhing and coiling like serpents. One lashed out, wrapping around Thomas' leg and pulling him to the ground. He screamed, clawing at the dirt, his fingers leaving bloody trails as he tried to free himself. Thomas Edward lunged, grabbing his friend's arm. The tendril tightened, pulling harder. Edward strained, his muscles burning, but it was like fighting against the tide. The shadows laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that reverberated through the trees. "You cannot save him," the spirit hissed. "You cannot even save yourself with a final, desperate cry." Thomas was dragged into the darkness. His screams cut off abruptly, leaving only the howling wind and the mocking laughter of the shadows. Edward fell back, gasping for breath. He wanted to run, to flee from this place and never return. But the faces of Margaret and Anna flashed before his eyes, and he knew he couldn't. If he failed, there would be next. He staggered to his feet, the lantern still clutched in his trembling hand. The shadows surged toward him, their forms shifting and changing, sometimes human, sometimes monstrous. They whispered his worst fears, his deepest regrets, their voices like knives. Edward clenched his teeth and stepped forward. "You won't win," he said, though the words felt hollow. The shadows paused, as if considering him. Then they lunged, a wave of darkness that blotted out all light. Edward swung the lantern, its flame flickering wildly. The light touched the shadows, and they recoiled, hissing and writhing. He took another step, then another, forcing them back. His heart thundered in his chest, but he kept moving, his eyes fixed on the shrine. The doors loomed before him, impossibly heavy and cold. The shadows clawed at him, tearing at his skin, but he ignored the pain. He pressed his hands against the stone, pushing with all his strength. The darkness pressed back, fighting him, but he refused to give in. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice shaking. And now, with a final, desperate push, the doors began to close. The light within flickered, dimming as the shadows screamed in rage. The ground shook, and for a moment Edward thought he would be swallowed whole. But then, with a deafening crash, the doors slammed shut. The light vanished and the shadows fell away, leaving only darkness and silence. Edward collapsed to the ground, every muscle in his body screaming in pain. He lay there, gasping for breath, the cold seeping into his bones. The shrine was sealed, but at what cost? Thomas was gone, and the spirit's hunger had only been delayed. He knew it would return, stronger and more determined than before. As the rain poured down around him, Edward closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Part 6. Confronting the Shadows. The night was a living thing, its darkness pressing down on the village like a suffocating weight. The rain had finally slowed, reduced to a thin, icy drizzle that clung to everything it touched. Wind howled through the trees, sending skeletal branches scraping against one another. In the center of it all, Edward stood at the edge of the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding like a drumbeat of fear and fury. The ground beneath his feet was slick with mud, and the cold air bit into his skin, but he felt none of it. There was only one thought in his mind: he had to protect his family. He had to end this. In his hand he clutched a rusty blade. It was an old thing, more a relic than a weapon, but it was all he had. The metal was pitted and dull, but its weight was comforting. He ran his thumb along the edge, feeling the nicks and chips, each one a reminder of battles fought long ago. This would be another battle, a battle for his life, for the lives of Margaret and Anna, and for whatever hope still lingered in the cursed village. The path to the shrine was narrow and winding, bordered by twisted trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead, blocking out even the faintest sliver of moonlight. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the stench of decay and something far older, far darker. Edward's grip on the blade tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee into the night and never return. But he pushed those thoughts aside. There was no turning back. Not now. The shadows were waiting for him. They moved along the edges of his vision, slipping through the trees like ink spreading through water. They whispered his name, their voices soft and mocking, each one a dagger aimed at his heart. Edward, they crooned, weaving around him like serpents. Why do you fight? You cannot win, you know this. He kept walking, his jaw clenched, his breath steaming in the frigid air. He would not listen. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of his failures, every mistake, every moment of weakness. They reminded him of his debts, of the nights spent watching Margaret cry herself to sleep, of the hunger in Anna's eyes when there was no food to give. You failed them, the shadows hissed, their words slithering into his mind like poison. You always fail, Edward stumbled, his vision blurring with tears. The weight of their words crushed down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. They were right, he had failed, again and again. But he couldn't give in. He forced himself to stand, to push forward. Not tonight, he whispered, his voice raw. Not now, the shadows laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. You're weak, Edward, they said, their forms shifting and writhing. You are nothing, no, he growled, the blade trembling in his grip. I am more than you think. He stepped into the clearing where the shrine loomed, its stone doors cracked open. Pale light seeped out, illuminating the carved symbols that pulsed and twisted as if alive. The shadows gathered around the entrance, their forms coiling and shifting, a wall of darkness that seemed impenetrable. Though Edward took a deep breath, his chest tight. The spirit was here, it was waiting. He raised the blade, its rusty edge catching the dim light. I'm not afraid of you, he said, though his voice shook. The shadows paused, as if surprised by his defiance. Then they surged forward, a tidal wave of darkness that swallowed him whole. The cold was unlike anything he had ever known, bone deep, soul-crushing. It wrapped around him, squeezing, suffocating. The whispers became a roar, drowning out his thoughts. You are nothing, they said. You are weak. You will die here, and your family will suffer. No, Edward screamed, his voice a ragged, desperate thing. He slashed at the darkness with the blade, the metal cutting through the air with a dull, heavy sound. The shadows recoiled, hissing. He lunged again, his movements wild and uncoordinated. He was no warrior, but he fought with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose. The shadows closed in, their tendrils wrapping around his arms, his legs. They pulled at him, dragging him down. Images flashed before his eyes, Margaret's face. Pale and tear-streaked Anna's laughter, bright and pure. He couldn't let them win. He wouldn't. You would not have them, he shouted, his voice raw with rage. The shadows laughed again, their grip tightening. What can you do, Edward, they sneered. You are nothing. You are alone. No, he whispered, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I'm not alone. He closed his eyes and reached deep within himself, searching for something, anything that could give him strength. He thought of his ancestors, of the stories they had told around the fire. They had faced darkness too. They had fought, bled, and died to protect what they loved. He could feel their presence now, a faint, flickering light in the darkness. Help me, he whispered. The light grew stronger, filling him with warmth. It pushed back against the cold, against the darkness. Edward opened his eyes, and for the first time he saw the shadows for what they truly were, twisted, broken things feeding on his fear. He gripped the blade tighter and stepped forward. You will not win, he said, his voice steady. The shadows screamed, a sound of rage and desperation. They lunged at him, their forms writhing and shifting. But Edward stood his ground. He swung the blade with all his strength, the metal cutting through the darkness like a beacon of light. The shadows fell back, their forms unraveling. No, they cried, their voices losing their power. This cannot be. Edward pressed forward, each step a battle. The light within him burned brighter, fueled by the strength of his ancestors, by the love he felt for his family. "You have no power over me," he said, his voice ringing out in the darkness. "I am not afraid," the shadows wavered, their forms flickering. The spirit's voice rose above the rest, a deep, resonant roar. "You will suffer," it bellowed. "You will break." Edward raised the blade one last time. "Not tonight," he said, and brought it down with all his strength. The light exploded outward, blinding and pure. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling, disintegrating into nothingness. The cold lifted, and for a moment there was only silence. Edward fell to his knees, the blade slipping from his grasp. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body trembling. But he had won. For now he had won. The shrine's doors were closed, the pale light gone. The darkness had been banished, but he knew it would return. It always did. Edward stood, his legs unsteady. He had fought back the darkness, but the battle was far from over. He had to protect his family, to keep fighting, because in the end that was all he had. The wind whispered through the trees, soft and mournful. The shadows were gone, but they would come again, and when they did, Edward would be ready. He had to be, for Margaret, for Anna, for the village that still clung to hope, however fragile. The darkness was patient, but so was he, and this time he would not break. Part 7. The Sacrifice. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at branches and flinging rain like icy needles against Edward's skin. The storm had turned the forest into a nightmare of noise and movement, but the true darkness lay ahead. Edward stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath ragged, his chest heaving. The shrine loomed before him, ancient and malevolent, its stone doors cracked open to reveal a sickly light that pulsed like the heartbeat of some monstrous thing. Shadows twisted and writhed around it, coiling and uncoiling with a will of their own. Edward tightened his grip on the rusty blade in his hand. It felt pitifully inadequate against the terror that lay within, but it was all he had. He glanced at Thomas, who stood beside him, pale and trembling. Rain streamed down Thomas's face, mixing with sweat and fear, but there was a spark of defiance in his eyes. Edward clung to that spark, using it to steady his own resolve. "The end is now," Edward said, his voice low but firm. Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. Together they stepped forward, their boots sinking into the mud with each heavy step. The shadows moved in an instant, a wave of darkness surging toward them. Edward braced himself, raising the blade as the tendrils of shadow lashed out. They struck with a cold, bone-deep chill, wrapping around his arms and legs, trying to pull him down. He gritted his teeth and slashed the blade, cutting through the darkness with a faint metallic hiss. The shadows recoiled, shrieking, but more took their place. The whispers began then, soft and insidious, worming their way into Edward's mind. "Why fight, Edward?" they murmured, their voices blending into one. "You cannot win. You cannot save anyone." He shook his head, trying to block them out. "Shut up," he snarled, swinging the blade again. The shadows hissed, but they did not retreat. They circled him, waiting, testing his strength. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Thomas struggling, his torch flickering wildly as he fought back the encroaching darkness. Edward Thomas's voice was ragged, filled with desperation. A tendril of shadow wrapped around his leg, pulling him to the ground. He clawed at the mud, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me." Edward lunged toward him, his heart pounding. He swung the blade, cutting through the tendril, but more came, wrapping around Thomas's arms, his chest. They lifted him into the air, twisting and tightening. Thomas's torch fell to the ground, sputtering in the rain. "No," Edward shouted, slashing at the shadows. "Let him go." The darkness laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You are too late," it whispered. "He is ours." Thomas's eyes met Edward's, and in that moment they were filled with a terrible clarity. "Edward," he gasped, his voice choked. "Don't let it take me." "I won't," Edward said, his voice breaking. He reached out, grabbing Thomas's arm. The cold burned his skin, but he didn't let go. "I won't let go." The shadows tightened their grip, pulling harder. Edward strained, his muscles burning, his vision blurring with rain and tears. He could feel Thomas slipping away, the weight of the darkness dragging him down. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't let me go." Edward's grip slipped, his fingers numb from the cold. The shadows surged, yanking Thomas from his grasp. He watched in horror as his friend was pulled toward the shrine, his body twisting and contorting, his screams echoing through the clearing. Thomas Edward stumbled forward, but the shadows blocked his path, forming a wall of impenetrable darkness. He slashed at them, his movements wild and desperate, but it was no use. They absorbed the light, the sound, everything. Thomas was dragged through the open doors of the shrine, his eyes wide and vacant, his mouth open in a final, silent scream. The doors slammed shut with a deafening boom, and the clearing fell into an unnatural silence. The wind stopped, the rain ceased. Even the shadows seemed to retreat, their forms melting into the darkness. Edward fell to his knees, the blade slipping from his grasp. He felt hollow, as if the darkness had torn something from him as well. His chest ached, and he couldn't catch his breath. He had failed. He had promised to protect Thomas, to end the curse, but he had failed. The shadows had won. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. "You are weak," they said. "You cannot save anyone." Edward clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to tear at the earth, to rage against the darkness. But there was nothing left, nothing but the cold and the silence and the weight of his own failure. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The shadows shifted around him, their forms flickering. "This is the price of defiance," they said. "You will suffer." Edward's head bowed, his body shaking. He had fought with everything he had, but it hadn't been enough. The shrine had claimed Thomas, just as it had claimed so many before him. The spirit was stronger than ever, and Edward knew it wasn't finished. It would come again. It would take more. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling. He had to go back. Margaret and Anna were waiting for him. He had to protect them, even if it meant facing the darkness again. He picked up the blade, its metal cold and heavy in his hand. The battle wasn't over. It would never be over. But he would fight. He had to. As he turned away from the shrine, the wind picked up once more, cold and biting. The shadows watched from the trees, their forms shifting and whispering. They would come again. They always did. But Edward would be ready. He had to be. For Thomas, for his family, for everyone who still dared to hope. He took a deep breath and stepped into the storm, the blade held tightly in his hand. The darkness was patient, but so was he. This time he would not break. Part 8. Sailing the shrine. The rain had turned the ground to mud, thick and unyielding, clutching at Edward's boots as he trudged back toward the shrine. Each step felt like a burden, the weight of his failure pressing down on him, threatening to break him. The air was cold and heavy, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous growl that reverberated through the trees. Edward barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the darkness that had swallowed Thomas. Thomas's scream still echoed in his ears, raw and desperate, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had tried to save him. He had fought with everything he had. But it hadn't been enough. The spirit had taken another life, and all Edward could do now was seal the doors and pray that it would buy them some time. The shrine loomed before him, ancient and unyielding. Its stone doors were cracked open, the sickly, pale light within pulsing like a heartbeat. Shadows coiled and writhed around the entrance, shifting and changing, as if mocking him. They seemed almost alive, whispering and laughing in voices that were both familiar and alien. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen what lay beyond those doors, the darkness that waited, hungry and patient. It was a darkness that fed on fear, on pain, on despair. And it was growing stronger. He forced himself to take another step, then another. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest. The rusty blade in his hand was slick with rain, its edge dull and chipped. It felt like a mockery, a reminder of how powerless he was against the ancient force that had claimed so many lives. But he couldn't stop now. He had to finish this. Edward, the shadows whispered, their voices soft and insidious. "Why fight? We cannot win. You cannot save them." He ignored them, his jaw clenched, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The shadows pressed closer, their forms shifting and changing. They took on shapes, faces he recognized. Margaret, her eyes wide with fear. Anna, reaching out for him. Thomas, his face twisted in pain. Edward's heart clenched, but he refused to look away. He knew what they were. He knew they were lies. "You failed him," the shadows hissed, their voices blending into one. "You will fail them too," No, Edward growled, his voice low and raw. "I won't." He stepped forward, raising the blade. The shadows recoiled, hissing like serpents. He could feel their hatred, their malice. They wanted to break him, to drag him down into the darkness. but he couldn't let them. Not now, not ever. The wind picked up, tearing at his clothes and whipping rain into his face. The light from the shrine flickered, growing dimmer. Edward reached the stone doors, his breath fogging in the cold air. The symbols carved into the stone glowed faintly, their light pulsating in time with his heartbeat. He placed a trembling hand on the cold surface, feeling the power that pulsed beneath his fingertips. The doors resisted, heavy and unyielding, as if they too were alive. "You cannot stop us," the spirit's voice boomed, deep and resonant. It echoed through the clearing, shaking the ground beneath his feet. "You are nothing," Edward gritted his teeth, pressing harder against the stone. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at him. "I'm not nothing," the shadows surged, their forms coiling around him like snakes. They whispered his darkest fears, his deepest regrets. They showed him visions Margaret and Anna, their bodies broken and lifeless. They showed him the village burning, consumed by the darkness. "This is your fate," they said. "This is the fate of all who defy us." Edward's knees buckled, but he refused to fall. He thought of Thomas, of the look in his eyes as the shadows took him. He thought of Margaret and Anna waiting for him back at the village. He couldn't let the spirit win. He couldn't let it take anyone else. With a roar of defiance, he pushed against the stone doors with all his strength. The symbols flared to life, their light blinding. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling, melting away into the darkness. The ground trembled and the air grew colder, but Edward didn't let go. He poured everything he had into the effort, every ounce of strength, every drop of hope. Slowly, inch by inch, the doors began to close. The spirit's voice rose, a howl of rage and desperation. "You cannot seal me forever," it bellowed. "I will return. I will feed." Edward gritted his teeth, his muscles burning. "Not today," he said, his voice raw. "Not now." With one final push, the door slammed shut. The light within the symbols flickered, then dimmed, leaving only darkness. The ground stilled, and the wind died. The shadows were gone, banished for now. Edward collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. His body felt like it was made of lead, every muscle trembling. The cold seeped into his bones and he shivered, but he didn't care. He had done it. He had sealed the shrine. But the victory felt hollow. Thomas was gone. Another life lost to the curse. Edward's chest ached, and tears streamed down his face. He had promised to protect him. He had promised to end this. And he had failed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The rain began to fall again, a slow, steady drizzle that soaked through his clothes and plastered his hair to his forehead. He let it wash over him, the cold numbing his skin. He thought of Margaret and Anna waiting for him back at the village. He had to go back. He had to protect them, even if it meant facing the darkness again. He forced himself to stand, every movement a struggle. He picked up the blade, its metal cold and heavy in his hand. The battle wasn't over. It would never be over. But he would fight. He had to. For Thomas. For his family. For everyone who still dared to hope. As he turned away from the shrine, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, mournful whisper. "You will fail," it said, its tone both mocking and sorrowful. Edward didn't respond. He knew the truth. He knew that the darkness would come again, that it would test him, break him, and push him to his limits. But he would fight. He would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Because in the end, the darkness could only win if he gave up. And that was something he would never do. Part 9. Living in Fear. The fog hung low over the village, dense and unyielding, swallowing everything it touched. It crept through the narrow streets and clung to the stone walls of the cottages, muffling sound and smothering light. The morning sun was a pale, distant thing, unable to pierce the thick, oppressive mist. To the villagers, it was as if the darkness itself had seeped into their bones, and no fire, no warmth, could drive it away. Edward stood at the edge of his small plot of land, staring toward the line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. Beyond those trees lay the shrine of blight on their existence, an open wound that refused to heal. The stone doors, which he had sealed with trembling hands, were hidden from view, but Edward felt their presence like a weight pressing down on him, a reminder of the horrors they contained, and the price that had already been paid. A cold wind blew, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Edward shivered, though not from the chill. He knew the scent too well. It was the stench of the curse, a sickness that lingered in the air, poisoning everything it touched. The villagers smelled it too. They avoided the forest now, steering clear of its shadowy edges. Children no longer played near the trees. The once bustling paths were overgrown with brambles and thorns, as if the land itself sought to keep them away. Edward turned back to the house, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching him with weary eyes. She had aged in the weeks since that night. Deep lines etched her face, and shadows lingered beneath her eyes. She tried to hide it, but Edward could see the toll the fear had taken on her, on all of them. Any sign, she asked, her voice low and hesitant. No, Edward replied, though he felt no relief. It's quiet, too quiet. Margaret nodded, but there was no comfort in her expression. Anna had another nightmare, she said, her voice trembling. She woke up screaming. Edward's chest tightened. He had heard her cry shrill, terrified, echoing through the thin walls of their home. Well, every night was the same. Shadows moved in her dreams, whispering things she could not understand but would never forget. He had tried to comfort her, to chase away the darkness, but he knew his words were hollow. What? The curse was real. The shadows were real. And Anna knew it. I'll talk to her, Edward said, forcing strength into his voice. She needs to know we're safe, are we? Margaret's question hung between them, heavy and unspoken for too long. Are we really safe? Edward, he wanted to lie, to tell her that they were, that he had sealed the shrine and banished the spirit. But the truth was a cruel, unyielding thing. For now, he said, his voice rough. We're safe for now. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. For now, she repeated, as if trying to believe it. Edward stepped inside, the warmth of the fire doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. Anna was sitting by the hearth, her knees drawn to her chest, staring into the flames. She looked so small, so fragile, and it broke his heart. He knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Hey, little one, he said softly. Bad dreams again, she nodded, her eyes never leaving the fire. The shadows were there, she whispered. They were calling to me. They can't hurt you, Edward said, though the words felt like ash on his tongue. I won't let them, but they took Uncle Thomas, Anna said, her voice cracking. They'll come back. Edward's throat tightened. He thought of Thomas, of the moment the shadows had dragged him into the shrine. He thought of his screams, of the look in his eyes. He wanted to tell Anna that it would never happen again, that he would protect her. But the curse was a living thing, relentless, patient. It would come again. He could only hope to be ready when it did. You're safe, he said, his voice firmer this time. I'm here. I'll always be here. Anna leaned into him, seeking comfort he wasn't sure he could give. He held her tightly, wishing he could shield her from the darkness that haunted their lives. But even as he whispered words of reassurance, he felt the cold weight of dread settling over him. The curse had not been broken. It had only been delayed. That night the wind howled through the village, rattling windows and sending chills down every spine. The villagers huddled in their homes, their doors barred and their fires stoked high. They spoke little, their conversations hushed and fearful. The scent of fear was thick in the air, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the forest. Edward sat by the window, his blade resting on his lap. It was old and worn, its edge dulled by time and use, but it was all he had. He kept his eyes on the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow set his heart racing. The spirit was patient, he knew. It would wait until their guard was down, until they were vulnerable, and then it would strike. He thought of the other villagers, their weary faces, their haunted eyes. They avoided him now, as if he carried the curse himself. Perhaps he did. He had faced the spirit and survived, but the cost had been high, too high. He had become a symbol of their fear, a reminder of the darkness that stalked them. He didn't blame them. He felt the weight of it every day. The shadows outside shifted, and for a moment Edward thought he saw something move. He tensed, his grip tightening on the blade. But it was only the wind playing tricks on his tired mind. He forced himself to relax, but the tension never truly left him. It never would. Margaret joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You need to rest, she said gently. You can't keep watch every night, I have to, Edward said, his voice hollow. If I don't, you're only one man, she said, her voice breaking. You can't fight this alone. He turned to her, seeing the fear in her eyes. I have to try, he said, for you, for Anna, for all of us. Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm scared, Edward," she whispered. "I'm so scared, me too," he admitted, his own voice cracking. "But we'll face it." Together they sat in silence, the wind howling around them. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Edward stared at those shadows, his heart heavy with dread. The curse was still there, waiting. The spirit was still hungry. The fight was far from over. In the days that followed, the villagers tried to carry on. They worked their fields, mended their homes, cared for their children, but the fear never left them. It was in every whispered conversation, every glance cast toward the forest. They avoided the paths that led to the shrine, leaving them to be reclaimed by nature. The trees grew thicker, the brambles more tangled. But it was not enough to keep the darkness away. Edward trained himself every day, honing his strength, sharpening his blade. He spoke with the few who dared to join him, teaching them what little he knew about fighting the shadows. It wasn't much, but it was something. He refused to be powerless. He refused to let the spirit win. One night, as he stood at the edge of the forest, he felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint, taunting laughter of the shadows. "We will return," they seemed to say. "We will always return." Edward's grip tightened on the blade. "I'll be ready," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his gut. "I'll be waiting." The shadows shifted, but they did not come, not yet. Edward turned and walked back to the village, his heart heavy but unbroken. He knew the fight would come again. The spirit would call, and the curse would try to claim more lives. But as long as he drew breath, he would stand against it. Because living in fear was not the same as giving in to it. And Edward would never surrender, not while there was still hope, not while there was still a chance to break the curse and free the village from the shadow that had haunted them for so long. As he reached his home, he looked back one last time. The forest loomed, dark and impenetrable. But he would not turn away. He would face it again and again for as long as it took. Because that was what it meant to fight the darkness. And Edward would fight until the very end.